The world's largest oil company, Exxon-Mobil, has come under fire for hiding climate change research and confusing the public about the fairly terrifying facts. The stakes here? The future of a planet. From WBUR Boston and NPR, I'm Tom Ashbrook. This hour on Point, we hear from the fifth-generation Rockefeller leading the charge and from Exxon-Mobil firing back. President of the Rockefeller Family Fund, Director of the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, David Kaiser. He has been out front on the Rockefeller family's efforts to uncover Exxon-Mobil policy for decades on research and not divulging research about climate change, and now is in the middle of a tangle with Exxon-Mobil as they have struck back, accusing the Rockefeller family of conspiracy against them. We've already been out in the New York Review of Books with a pretty big accusation against Exxon-Mobil. You've got more coming. I'm quoting just a little bit from that. This is on climate change. In our opinion, the reason the world has failed to act for so long is in no small part because the climate denial campaign that Exxon helped devise and lead was so successful, calling ExxonMobil policy over the years repugnant. What's the heart of your argument with ExxonMobil?
Two different teams of independent journalists have recently discovered internal Exxon documents. These documents show us that Exxon has understood and accepted the reality of climate change since the late 1970s, not only acknowledging that climate change would be coming, but that it would have catastrophic results in the near future unless humanity stopped burning fossil fuels in such vast quantities. That was in the late 1970s. They stayed quiet about that knowledge. Then in 1988, the summer of 88, a number of different things happened. There was the costliest drought in American history. Second of all, there was a heat wave that claimed more than 5,000 lives. The NASA scientist James Hansen testified before Congress that climate change is real, it is coming soon, and it will affect all people. And suddenly there was a sort of panic about climate change. Time magazine had endangered Earth as its planet of the year, and Exxon seems to have panicked. Or in any case, they made a very fateful decision, which was rather than tell the public what they knew about the reality of climate change, they decided instead to concentrate on their own short-term profits and to do that by deceiving the American public and policymakers about the reality of climate change. They did this by deliberately copying the strategy employed by the tobacco industry in the 40 years when they were denying the danger of smoking, by hiring unscrupulous scientists, paying them through front groups to claim smoking did not damage health when the scientific consensus was clear that it did, and then finding right-wing think tanks who they also supported that would serve as a sort of validating echo chamber for those claims. That is exactly the strategy that Exxon followed, and the reason we think they were deliberately copying the tobacco strategy is that not only did they do the same things, they actually used very many of the same scientists and many of the same right-wing think tanks to execute that strategy. So just as Big Tobacco's denial campaign bought that industry 40 years of immense profits before its deceptions were revealed, Exxon's denial campaign has allowed it to record some of the largest profits in human history. In 2007 alone, their
profit was $40 billion.
In the meantime, we've lost a crucial 25 years, and unless we change course very, very fast now, we will be committed within the next 2 or 3 decades to a world characterized by spreading and growing natural disasters, dwindling resources, spreading disease, mass extinctions, famine, political instability, war, and unprecedented human migration. They need to offer the American public a complete explanation of their campaign of deception. As recently as last year at Exxon's shareholders meeting, the present CEO, Rex Tillerson, was openly mocking the idea of investing in renewables. So the small amounts of money that they have put in that direction have just been meant to serve as a fig leaf to cover up a very ugly truth. They haven't gotten serious about it. They need to, not only for the environment, but for their own long-term business prospects. Humanity simply cannot continue to burn fossil fuels the way we have been. Exxon continues to give much, much more money in campaign contributions to climate-denying congresspeople. The tobacco industry ended up paying billions of dollars to the states to help cover healthcare costs of the damage they had done to people's health through their deceptions. I think something along those lines would be appropriate for Exxon as the effects of climate change become stronger and stronger. From a moral perspective, it is clearly ExxonMobil's obligation to explain to the American people how they have been deliberately, cynically deceiving them for some 25 years now in order to bolster their own corporate profits. The really important point here is how successful their campaign of deception has been. There was a recent Yale University study that found that only 11% of the American public understands that there is a clear and overwhelming scientific consensus, not only that climate change is real, but that it's caused by humans burning fossil fuels, and that if we don't change our behavior very soon, catastrophe is coming. Exxon-Mobil bears a lot of responsibility for that. They owe it to the American people to explain that this whole so-called debate over climate science has in fact been a con. It was perpetrated by many players in the fossil fuel industry, but Exxon-Mobil, along with the Koch family foundations, has been one of the two most important players. It was perpetrated by the fossil fuel industry. It was patterned after Big Tobacco's campaign of deception. At this point, people who don't believe in climate change have either been duped by that con or they're participating in it.
From Irving, Texas, Alan Jeffers. He's Media Relations Manager at Exxon-Mobil. How do you see what's unfolding, Mr. Jeffers?
Exxon-Mobil believes that climate change is real, the risk is real, and we're working very hard to reduce emissions in our operations and help consumers of our products reduce their emissions. The allegations against us stem from journalism that was hired and paid for by the two Rockefeller activist organizations, the one Mr. Kaiser is working with, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They hired journalists at Columbia University Inside Climate News to go into our public archives. They pulled the same documents. If you've read any of the documents these reports were based upon, but they simply don't say what the reports say they say. It's just simply not true.
So you're rejecting the entire premise that Exxon understood what was going on with climate change and buried that knowledge or hid it. But their reporting says not only did it know, but that it made corporate decisions carefully based on that insight, that it was important to the future profitability of the company to understand where they might explore, where CO2 levels were highest, that there was a lot of internal planning that was premised on this research.
The thesis is that a handful of employees at Exxon reached definitive conclusions about climate change decades before the rest of the world's best climate scientists. And then, like some kind of James Bond villain, covered that up for profit. It's just not credible.
Why not? I mean, ExxonMobil is the world's biggest oil company. It has vast resources. It has the biggest possible interest in these very questions. So it doesn't seem entirely unfeasible that in terms of its future operations and profit and strategy, it might not want things slowed down on the exploration and pumping front.
We absolutely did support a broad industry coalition that opposed the Kyoto Protocol. Opposition to policy and differing of views on potential outcomes should not be labeled as climate denial in some sort of Orwellian effort to silence people they don't agree with. We opposed policy that we did not agree with. That should not be some sort of scarlet letter in this country. You should be free to oppose policy.
Here's New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. He's announced an investigation of ExxonMobil.
We're very interested in seeing what science Exxon has been using for its own purposes, because they are tremendously active offshore oil drilling in the Arctic, for example, where global warming is happening at a much more rapid rate than in more temperate zones. Were they using the best science and the most competent models for their own purposes, but then telling the public, regulators and shareholders that no competent models existed?
Jim in Gatlinburg, Tennessee.
I'd like to point out that, contrary to what he said, Exxon has not merely advocated a position. They have misrepresented properties, the nature of the product that they sell. People who bought their product were deceived into thinking that they were not inflicting tremendous harm on something they care about. Now, in the case of cigarettes, that would be one's own personal body, but in the case of gasoline and nowadays natural gas, that would be their world and their children. The fraud against the consumer is the same in both cases.
David Kaiser in New York.
Mr. Jeffers made a number of allegations that I'd like to respond to. He repeated a line that Exxon has been trying out for about a year now, which is that people have been demanding that it should have recognized the reality of climate change decades before the rest of the world's scientific community. And I'm sure that there are people in his business, PR, who have a rhetorical word for this technique to invent something that nobody else has ever said and then defend yourself against that. The fact is that there was a scientific consensus emerging in the 1970s that Earth would begin to warm appreciably within the next few decades because of the carbon dioxide being released by fossil fuel combustion and by deforestation. And Exxon, with its very considerable scientific resources and expertise, understood and agreed with this consensus consensus as it emerged, and there's significant documentary evidence of this. So that's one thing. Another is this line that we have been cherry-picking the documents that we've had, and he said he didn't want to bore your listeners by getting into the details. I urge Exxon at some point to take the risk of boring us and actually respond to the articles that I've written in the New York Review of Books, and I urge people to give them a read because I think it's quite persuasive. The fact is that there's this extensive record now that comes from internal Exxon documents, both that they acknowledged internally that climate change was real and also that they supported the climate denial movement, and more than supported it, they participated in it, not only with comments like the one from Lee Raymond that played earlier, but by, for example, using their influence with the George W. Bush administration to have a lot of scientists who were honorable, disinterested people and who believed, like most scientists, that climate change is real, had to have them fired from the White House and the State Department and replaced with climate skeptics who the company thought would be more favorable to it. Even if people are uncertain who to believe here, we can also look at the ways that Exxon spent its money, because the fact is that for all of its propaganda, Exxon has always kept a very clear eye on scientific reality
when making important business decisions.
So for a few examples, Exxon paid $400 million to acquire the rights to a natural gas field in the South China Sea, and then its scientists discovered that it was unusually carbon intensive, and Exxon decided not to exploit that. They just lose the $400 million. It's a responsible decision, by the way, but it does point out that they knew that climate change was real. Similarly, Mr. Jeffers talked about investments that Exxon has made in the Canadian Arctic, and he tried to claim that this was due to Canadian governmental regulations. That is contradicted by some of the documents that these excellent journalists have found. There was a senior scientist at Exxon's Canadian subsidiary who said in 1991, this is 5 years before the Lee Raymond quote you played where Mr. Jeffers said there was no scientific consensus yet. In 1991, this senior scientist told a conference of engineers that concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were increasing, and I quote, due to the burning of fossil fuels. Nobody disputes this fact. Any major development with a lifespan of, say, 30 to 40 years will need to assess the impacts of potential global warming. This is particularly true of Arctic and offshore projects in Canada, where warming will clearly affect sea ice, icebergs, permafrost, and sea levels. Following those comments, Exxon spent a lot of money to shore up its Arctic infrastructure. Mr. Jeffers was impugning the independence and honorability of the journalists we've worked with, and I really resent the fact that he did so. These are excellent people. It's true that we gave them some funding. That's a normal thing. We in no way dictated or steered the results that they would come up with. In fact, when we were in early discussions with the people at Columbia, we didn't put any particular emphasis on Exxon. We said we thought it would be interesting to try to find out what the oil business generally had known about climate change and when. And the fact is that what they found was most powerful when it came to Exxon, and also Exxon has the clearest track record of having supported the climate denial movement. So it sort of made the best and most persuasive story there, but this was done by completely legitimate journalists. We did not steer their outcome in any way.
More callers for you. Tony in Macomb, Michigan.
I'm somewhat of a skeptic. I feel that the taxes and all the things that happen because of the so-called climate change crowd affect a small person like myself as opposed to Mr. Rockefeller and the Exxon people. I would just like to ask Mr. Rockefeller how he gets around the country and the world.
Nobody is suggesting that we simply and completely abandon fossil fuels tomorrow. We're not ready to do that. Part of the reason we're not ready to do it is because we haven't made the transition to a clean, renewable energy economy that we should have started making 25 years ago. Part of the reason we haven't done that is because of the success of Exxon's deception campaign. Short-term economic pain is one thing, and I don't mean to minimize it. It's a serious, serious thing. But we're also talking about a near-term future within just a few decades of the kind of catastrophe that makes that sort of economic pain really pale by comparison. The caller is sort of imagining what my life is like, and it's not really very accurate. Now, that's not to say we can't all do better when it comes to these things, but when I need to travel across the country, I fly commercially. I fly economy, by the way, and I don't have a private jet. And there's one more point to make, too. If the United States were to become a leader in the production of clean energy, with everything that involves, there is enormous economic potential there, which will mean thousands and hundreds of thousands of jobs and significant economic growth if we were to start pursuing it seriously.
Austin, Texas is on the line. Yonis.
About a decade ago, I was working with thousands of other students in upstate New York, and we actually took on CFACT, which is Committee for Constructive Tomorrow, which was actually funded by Exxon. And I watched them spend millions on small organizations on the university level to disrupt climate activists and kind of help defund any kind of environmental activism on colleges. And I actually encountered them again when I worked for Greenpeace at COP14 in Poznan, Poland. And they actually came to the United Nations Framework Convention and dressed up in polar bear costumes and held signs that said, "We have enough ice." You know, Exxon has spent decades basically denying climate change or muddying the issue, exactly what the Rockefellers are saying. And I've watched it happen, and it's a sad sight.
David Kaiser, in the forthcoming piece you've got in the New York Review of Books, you're talking about Exxon-Mobil's reserves of fossil fuels. What would happen if those were stranded by policies that kept them from being pumped or burned or used or sold? They have stated they're confident that none of those hydrocarbon reserves will become stranded, that is, unused.
Exxon claims that if they are wrong about that, they're simply wrong and that it's not fraud. I would argue that Exxon has really given up much right to the benefit of the doubt at this point, but that is possible. I also think it is possible that the attorneys general are going to find, if they get the documents they're demanding, that Exxon internally didn't believe what they were telling their shareholders, and that's the purpose of an investigation. Exxon has a reputation for being pretty determined, let's say, in the pursuit of its self-interest, and certainly one of the things that I can imagine is that they bring what's called a SLAP suit against us. That's an acronym for a strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's the kind of thing that a big company with limitless resources does when they know they can't win a suit. They're willing to pay huge lawyer fees themselves, hoping that similar fees will be much more damaging to the small organizations that they target. And I think that kind of thing is possible. If it comes, I'm entirely confident that the truth is so clearly on our side that even if we can't quite match their team of lawyers, I don't expect that we would ever lose a suit like that, but we might have to spend some money defending ourselves.